The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. Chapter 1. The house stood on a slight rise just on the edge of the village. It stood on its own and looked out over a broad spread of west country farmland. Not a remarkable house by any means. It was about 30 years old, squattish, squarish, made of brick, and had 4 windows set in the front of a size and proportion which more or less exactly failed to please the eye. The only person for whom the house was in any way special was Arthur Dent, and that was only because it happened to be the one he lived in. He had lived in it for about 3 years, ever since he had moved out of London, because it made him nervous and irritable. He was about 30 as well. Tall, dark-haired, and never quite at ease with himself. The only thing that used to worry him most was the fact that people always used to ask him what he was so worried about. He worked in local radio, which he always used to tell his friends was a lot more interesting than they probably thought. It was, too. Most of his friends worked in advertising. On Wednesday night it had rained very heavily. The lane was wet and muddy, but the Thursday morning sun was bright and clear as it shone in Arthur Dent's house, for what was to be that last time. It hadn't properly registered yet with Arthur, that the council wanted to knock it down and build a bypass instead. At 8 o'clock on Thursday morning, Arthur didn't feel very good. He woke up blearily, got up, wandered blearily around his room, opened a window, saw a bulldozer, found his slippers, and stomped off to the bathroom to wash. Toothpaste on the brush, scrub. Shaving mirror pointed at the ceiling. He adjusted it. For a moment it reflected a second bulldozer through the bathroom mirror. Properly adjusted it, reflected Arthur Dent's bristles. He shaved them off, washed, dried, and stomped off to the kitchen to find something pleasant to put in his mouth. Kettle, plug, fridge, milk, coffee, yawn. The word bulldozer wandered through his mind for a moment in search of something to connect with. The bulldozer outside the kitchen window was quite a big one. He stared at it. Yellow, he thought, and stomped back off to bed in a room to get dressed. Passing the bathroom, he stopped to drink a large glass of water and another. He began to suspect that he was hungover. Why was he hungover? Had he been drinking the night before? He supposed that he must have been. He caught a glint in the shaving mirror. Yellow, he thought, and stomped onto the bedroom. He stood and thought. The pub, he thought, oh dear, the pub. He vaguely remembered being angry. Angry about something that had seemed rather important. He'd been telling people about it at great length, he rather suspected. His clearest visual recollection was of the glazed looks on other people's faces. Something about a new bypass he'd just found out about. It had been in the pipeline for months, only no one seemed to have known it. Ridiculous. He took a swig of water. It would sort itself out, he decided. No one wanted a bypass. The council didn't have a leg to stand on. It would sort itself out. God, what a terrible hangover that had earned him, though. He looked at himself in the wardrobe mirror. He stuck at his tongue. Yellow, he thought. The word yellow wandered through his mind in search of something to connect with. 15 seconds later, he was out of his house and lying in front of a big yellow bulldozer that was advancing up his garden path. Mr. L. Prosser was, as I say, only human. In other words, he was a carbon-based bipedal life form descended from an ape. More specifically, he was 40, fat, and shabby, and worked for the local council. Curiously enough, though he didn't know it, he was also a direct male-line descendant of Genghis Khan, though intervening generations and racial mixing had so juggled his genes that he had no discernible Mongolian characteristics, and only vestiges left in Mr. L. Prosser of his mighty ancestry were the pronounced stoutiness around the tongue, and a predilection for little fur hats. He was by no means a great warrior. In fact, he was a nervous man. Today he was particularly nervous and worried because something had gone seriously wrong with his job, which was to see that Arthur Dent's house got cleared out of the way before the day was out. "Come off it, Mr. Dent," he said. "You can't win, you know. You can't lie in front of the bulldozer indefinitely." He tried to make his eyes blaze fiercely, but they just wouldn't do it. Arthur lay in the mud and squelched at him. "I'm game," he said. "We'll see who rusts first." "I'm afraid you're going to have to accept it," said Mr. Prosser, gripping his fur hat and rolling it around the top of his head. "This bypass has got to be built, and it's going to be built." "First I've heard of it," said Arthur. "Why has it got to be built?" Mr. Prosser shook his finger at him for a bit, then stopped and put it away again. "What do you mean, why's it got to be built?" he said. "It's a bypass. You've got to build bypasses." Bypasses are devices which allow some people to dash from point A to point B very fast, whilst other people dash from point B to point A very fast. People living at point C, being a point directly in between, are often given to wonder what's so great about point A that so many people from point B are so keen to get there, and what's so great about point B that so many people from point A are so keen to get there. They often wish that people would just once and for all work out where the hell they want to be. Mr. Prosser wanted to be at point D. Point D wasn't anywhere in particular, just any convenient point a very long way from points A, B, and C. He would have a nice little cottage at point D, with axes all over the door, and spend a pleasant amount of time at point E, which would be the nearest pub to point D. His wife, of course, wanted climbing roses, but he wanted axes. He didn't know why. He just liked axes. He flushed hotly under the derisive grins of the bulldozer drivers. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, but it was equally uncomfortable on each. Obviously someone had been appallingly incompetent, and he hoped to God it wasn't him. Mr. Prosser said you were quite entitled to make any suggestions or protests at the appropriate time, you know. Appropriate time? Hooted Arthur. Appropriate time? The first I knew about it was when a workman arrived at my home yesterday. I asked him if he'd come to clean the windows, and he said no, he'd come to demolish the house. He didn't tell me straight away, of course. Oh no, he wiped a couple windows and charged me $5. Then he told me. But Mr. Dent, the plans have been available in the local planning office for the last 9 months. Oh yes, well, as soon as I heard, I went straight round to see them yesterday afternoon. You hadn't exactly gone out of your way to call attention to them, had you? I mean, like actually telling anyone or anything. But the plans were on display. On display? I eventually had to go down to the cellar to find them. That's the display department. With a torch. Ah, well, the lights had probably gone. So had the stairs. But look, you found the notice, didn't you? Yes, said Arthur. Yes, I did. It was on display in the bottom room of a locket filing cabinet, stuck in a disused lavatory, with a sign on the door saying, "Beware of the leopard." A cloud passed overhead. It cast a shadow over Arthur Dent as he lay propped up on his elbow in the cold mud. Cast a shadow over Arthur Dent's house. Mr. Prosser frowned at all of it. "It's not as if it's a particularly nice house," he said. "I'm sorry, but I happen to quite like it." "You like the bypass?" "Oh, shut up," said Arthur Dent. "Shut up and go away, and take your bloody bypass with you. You haven't got a leg to stand on, and you know it." Mr. Prosser's mouth opened and closed a couple of times, whilst in his mind, for a moment, filled with inexplicable but terribly attractive visions of Arthur Dent's house being consumed with fire, and Arthur himself running screaming from the blazing ruin, with at least 3 hefty spears protruding from his back. Mr. Prosser had also been bothered with visions like these, and they made him feel very nervous. He stuttered for a moment, and then pulled himself together. "Mr. Dent," he said. "Hello?" "Yes," said Arthur. "Some factual information for you. Have you any idea how much damage that bulldozer would suffer if I let it roll straight over you?" "How much?" said Arthur. "None at all," said Mr. Prosser, and stormed nervously off, wondering why his brain was filled with 1,000 hairy horsemen all shouting at him. By a curious coincidence, none at all is exactly how much suspicion the ape descendant Arthur Dent had that one of his closest friends was not descended from an ape, but was, in fact, from a small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Betelgeuse, and not from Guilford, as he usually claimed. Arthur Dent had never ever suspected this. This friend of his first arrived on the planet Earth some 15 Earth years previous, and he had worked hard to blend himself into Earth society with, it must be said, some success. For instance, he had spent those 15 years pretending to be an out-of-work actor, which was possible enough. He had made one careless blunder, though, because he had skimped a bit on his preparatory research. The information he had gathered had led him to choose the name Ford Perfect as being nicely inconspicuous. He was not conspicuously tall. His features were striking, but not conspicuously handsome. His hair was wiry and gingerish, and brushed backwards from the temples. His skin seemed to be pulled back from the nose, and there was something very slightly odd on him. But it was difficult to say what it was. Perhaps it was that his eyes didn't seem to blink often enough. When you talked to him for any length of time, your eyes involuntarily to water on his behalf. Perhaps it was his smile slightly too broad, and gave people the unnerving impression that he was about to go for their neck. He struck most of the friends he had made on Earth as oddly eccentric, but a harmless one. An unruly boozer with some oddish habits, for instance, he would often gate-crash university parties, get badly drunk, and start making fun of any astrophysicist he could find, till he got thrown out. Sometimes he got seized with oddly distracted modes, and would stare into the sky as if hypnotized until someone asked him what he was doing. Then he would start guiltily for a moment, relax, and grin. "Oh, just looking for flying saucers," he would joke, and everyone would laugh and ask him what sort of flying saucers he was looking for. "Green ones," he would reply with a wicked grin, laughing wildly for a moment, and then suddenly lunge at the nearest bar and buy an enormous round of drinks. Evenings like this usually ended badly. Ford would get out of his skull on whiskey, huddled in the corner with some girl, and explain to her in slurred phrases that honestly the color of flying saucers didn't matter that much, really. Thereafter, staggering semi-paraplegic down the night streets, he would often ask passing policemen if they knew the way to Beetlejuice. The policeman would usually say something like, "Don't you think it's about time you went off home, sir?" "I'm trying to, baby, I'm trying to," is what Ford invariably replied to these responses. In fact, he was really looking for, when he stared directly into the sky, was any kind of flying saucer at all. Any kind of flying saucer at all. Sorry, it's just texting you back, baby. Ford wished that a flying saucer would arrive soon, because he knew how to flag flying saucers down and get lifts from them. He knew how to see the marvels of the universe for less than 30 Altarian dollars a day. In fact, Ford Perfect was a roving researcher for a wholly new remarkable book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Humans beings are great adapters, and by lunchtime life in the environs of Arthur's house had settled into a steady routine. It was Arthur's accepted role to lie squelching the mud and making occasional demands to see his lawyer, his mother, or a good book, and it was Mr. Prosser's accepted role to tackle Arthur with the occasional new ploy, such as the "for the public good" talk, or the march of progression talk, the "they knocked my house down once, never looked back" talk, and various other categories and threats. And it was the bulldozer driver's accepted role to sit around drinking coffee and experimenting with union regulations to see how they could turn the situation to their financial advantage. The earth moved slowly in its diurnal course. The sun was beginning to dry out the mud that Arthur lay in. The shadow moved across him again. "Hello, Arthur," said the shadow. Arthur looked up and squinted into the sun. Was startled to see Ford Perfect standing above him. "Ford, hello, how are you?" "Fine," said Ford. "Look, are you busy?" "Am I busy?" exclaimed Arthur. "Well, I've got all these bulldozers and things to lie in front of me because they'll knock down my house if I don't. But other than that, well, no, not especially. Especially, why?" They don't have sarcasm on Beetlejuice, and Ford Perfect often failed to notice it unless he was concentrating. He said, "Good. Is there anywhere we can talk?" "What?" said Arthur Dent. For a few seconds, Ford seemed to ignore him. He stared fixably at the sun, like a rabbit trying to run. Like a rabbit trying to get run over by a car. Then suddenly he squatted down beside Arthur. "We've got to talk," he said urgently. "Fine," said Arthur. "Talk." "And drink," said Ford. "It's invariably important that we talk and drink. Now, we'll go to the pub in the village." He looked at the sky again, nervous and expectant. "Look, don't you understand?" shouted Arthur. He pointed at Prosser. "That man wants to knock down my house." Ford glanced at him, puzzled. "Well, he can do it whilst you're away, can't he?" he said. "But I don't want him to." "Ah," Ford said. "Look, what's the matter with you, Ford?" said Arthur. Nothing's the matter. Listen to me. I've got to tell you the most important thing you've ever heard. I've got to tell you now, and I've got to get you in the saloon bar at the Horse and Groom." "But why?" "Because you're going to need a very stiff drink." Ford stared at Arthur, and Arthur was astonished to find his will beginning to weaken. He didn't realize that this was because of an old drinking game that Ford had learned to play in the hyperspace ports that served the Mandrite mining belts in the star system of Orion Beta. The game was not unlike the Earth game called Indian Wrestle. It was played like this. Two contestants would sit on either side of the table with a glass in front of each of them. Between them would be placed a bottle of chance spirit. unimmortalized in that ancient Orion mining song. Oh, don't give me none more of that old gent spirit.